Once, there was a boy named Johnny. He lived in a village with his family. His father, mother, and brother Michael cared for him. Johnny was very naughty. He loved playing tricks on others. He didn't care if it caused trouble. His parents were worried about him. They often told him to behave. But Johnny never listened. Michael also tried to guide him. But Johnny didn't change. He kept causing trouble. His family didn't know what to do. During break time, Mike left his geometry box on his desk while rushing out to play. Johnny noticed it and quickly decided to play a prank. He grabbed the box and hid it under the last desk in the classroom before running out to enjoy the break. After the break, during math class, teacher asked everyone to take out their geometry boxes. Mike checked his bag and looked confused.
"Where is it?"
he murmured.
"Mike, why haven't you taken out your box yet?"
the teacher asked, her tone sharp.
"Ma'am, my box is missing,"
Mike replied nervously.
"That's not an excuse. You need to be responsible,"
the teacher scolded. Mike felt ashamed as his classmates giggled quietly. After the period ended, Albert noticed something under the last desk.
"Hey, isn't this your geometry box, Mike?"
he said, picking it up. Mike took the box and glanced at Johnny, who was smirking in the corner. He knew Johnny was behind it but decided to say nothing. He knew it's useless. After lunch, Johnny saw Mrs. Laura's goat tied to a mango tree. No one around was around. He went back to his house, came back with a knife and cut the rope. The goat ran off, and Johnny smiled as he went back home. When Mrs. Laura saw her goat was gone, she immediately knew who was behind it. She knocked on the door and said,
"Johnny, did you let my goat run away?"
Johnny's mom opened the door and heard Mrs. Laura's complaint. She scolded Johnny, saying,
"You shouldn't play tricks like that. Don't do it again."
Johnny kicked at the floor as his mom's scolding echoed in the room. Later, some villagers caught the goat and took it back to Mrs. Laura's house. During break time, Johnny was eating a sandwich with his friend Robert. As they chatted, Johnny noticed a student standing nearby, talking to his friend. With a mischievous smile, Johnny stood up, walked over, and accidentally bumped into the student, making him fall to the ground.
Oh, sorry.
Johnny quickly said, grabbing the student's arm and pulling him up.
I was just walking and didn't balance myself.
The student looked confused but nodded, while Johnny smiled and quickly sat back down on the bench, trying not to laugh. Robert looked at him, shaking his head.
Johnny, that wasn't funny.
Johnny shrugged and smiled. Robert sighed, not saying more. One evening, Johnny came home from the store with a bag of cookies. He rang Uncle Sam's doorbell really hard and ran to his house. Uncle Sam, watering his plants on the lawn, peeped out immediately and saw Johnny running away.
This boy is always ringing my bell and running off. But now I have seen him do it myself.
He muttered angry. He decided to complain to Johnny's parents. Uncle Sam walked over to Johnny's house and rang the doorbell. Johnny's dad, sipping tea with his wife, went to the door and opened it. Mr. Sam, looking frustrated, said,
Johnny rang my doorbell really hard and ran off again. This is the 4th time this week. I swear, he has got a personal mission to drive me crazy.
Johnny's dad raised an eyebrow and said,
Johnny, that's enough of the tricks. Stop bothering Mr. Sam and apologize to him right now.
Johnny, not really caring, said,
Sorry, Uncle Sam.
before turning away. Mr. Sam shook his head in disappointment and walked off. In class, Johnny felt jealous of Harry. Every teacher praised him, and he always came first in class. Johnny didn't like it and decided to do something about it, especially after Teacher Ava praised Harry so much. After break, it was time for the science test, while everyone else was outside. Johnny went to Harry's bag, took out his pen, and went to the washroom. He drained all the ink and then put the pen back into his pencil box. When class started and the test began, Harry tried to write but noticed the ink was gone.
But I filled it in the morning.
He thought. He looked worried. Teacher Ava saw him and asked,
What's wrong? Harry?
Harry said,
The ink is finished in my pen.
Teacher Ava frowned.
What nonsense! Don't you know today is an important test?
Harry's eyes filled with tears. Teacher Ava then asked,
Can anyone help him?
Johnny stood up and said,
Ma'am, give him my extra pen. It's full of ink.
Teacher Ava smiled.
Good boy.
As Harry took Johnny's pen, Johnny smiled to himself. It was a sunny afternoon when Johnny noticed Mrs. Jasmine's clay pots drying outside her house. Seeing no one around, he picked up a stone and threw it at the pots, shattering them one by one. Then he hurried back home and pretended to study. Later, Mrs. Jasmine returned from the grocery store and was shocked.
Oh no! All my hard work!
She immediately went to Johnny's house.
Johnny broke all my pots,
Mrs. Jasmine said. Johnny's mom frowned.
Our son is naughty. But he wouldn't do that.
Mrs. Jasmine's shoulders slumped.
If you don't believe me, I can't do much.
She turned and walked away quietly. One morning, Michael, Johnny's older brother, had a fever. Their parents were worried and decided to take him to the doctor.
Johnny, please stay at home,
Mom said. Dad said,
Don't trouble anyone.
Johnny nodded, and they left. Johnny thought,
Oh, it's time to pluck mangoes from Mrs. Laura's tree.
He went out, climbed the tree, and tried to pluck a mango. But suddenly he slipped and fell. He shouted,
Ah! My leg!
Mrs. Laura and Mrs. Jasmine rushed out of their houses. They helped him up, but his leg hurt, and his arm was bleeding. Mrs. Laura took him inside, while Mrs. Jasmine ran to fetch the doctor. In the kitchen, Mrs. Jasmine warmed milk, added a pinch of turmeric powder and a tablespoon of honey, stirred it, and brought it to Johnny. Johnny hesitated to drink but slowly took the glass. Soon, the doctor arrived, checked Johnny's wounds, bandaged them, and gave a prescription. Mrs. Jasmine rushed to get the medicine, and Mrs. Laura paid the doctor's fee, and he left. Mrs. Laura then went to the kitchen and made chicken cornflour soup. While the soup was cooking, she spread fresh cream on rusk and gave it to Johnny. Mrs. Jasmine returned and gave Johnny his medicine with water. Mrs. Laura said,
I'm making chicken soup. You can eat bread with it.
Johnny felt ashamed and started crying.
I'm sorry. I always tried to trouble you. I promise I will never misbehave with anyone again.
Moral: pranks may cause harm, but kindness and respect heal.